Curly told me once, when we were sitting on the ledge above Long Point with the whole gorge sunk in fog below us like a bowl full of milk, that when a place has been walked by something old the ground remembers it before the trees do, and I did not fully understand what he meant until the winter sword-bearer went missing on the trail below Beauty Mountain, and the search we ran for him lasted 11 days, and the report I wrote at the end of it was accepted by the region but was never true. I have carried the arrowhead patch on my shoulder for 19 years in this gorge, 53 miles of the New River cutting a canyon through the plateau of southern West Virginia, more than 70,000 acres of near vertical woodland and abandoned coal camps and grades where the rails have been pulled up and grades where the rails are still there, and the CSX freights still run past midnight and shake the coffee cups in the operations building at Glen Jean. I have written my share of reports on falls and drownings and the ordinary tragedies that a place like this delivers to people who did not respect it. Swordbearer was not one of those. Swordbearer was a law enforcement ranger, 41 years old, 6'2" and 240 pounds. A man who had spent 12 seasons in this park before he came to us, and who could navigate the endless wall in a snowstorm without a map. He carried a Glock and a radio and a Garmin and a printed contingency, and he called in every hour on the hour, and he did not miss a call in 9 years. On the morning of December 7th, he left the ranger station at Cunard at 6:40 in the morning to hike the old grade above Kmore No. 2 on a welfare check, a call that had come in the night before from a resident of Fayetteville who said she had seen a light moving on the ridge that should not have been there. The temperature at first light was 19 degrees. There were 2 inches of dry snow on the ground, and a wind moving through the rhododendron in that low whistling way it does when the gorge is cold enough for the sound to carry all the way up from the river. Swordbearer's last call came in at 7:53. He said he had found tracks. He said the tracks were larger than he expected. He said he was going to follow them a little way to see where they went, and he would call in at 9. He did not call in at 9. He did not call in at 10. At 10:45, Red Eagle, who was dispatching that morning from the operations building at Glen Jean, put out the first alert, and by noon we had 32 people and 2 helicopters in the gorge below Beauty Mountain, and by the following morning we had 140. We searched for 11 days. We found his hat on the second day, hooked on a broken branch 4 feet above a bend in the grade where nothing about the geometry made sense. We found his radio on the 4th day, 40 yards off the grade in a hollow between 2 boulders, the battery still in it, still transmitting a carrier signal but no voice. We found his sidearm on the 7th day at the base of a hemlock that had been broken in half 12 feet up. The trunk snapped clean through, the brake pushed inward as though something had shoved against the tree from the outside, with a weight the tree was not built to hold. We did not find Swordbearer. What we found instead, on the 9th day, in a hollow above the old Kmore bench where a spring seeps out of the sandstone and freezes in a sheet through the winter months, was a print in the ice that was 19.5 inches long from heel to toe, and 8 inches wide at the ball. And there were 4 more like it, running in a straight line down the hollow toward the river and disappearing into a stand of pine. And beside the 3rd print, pressed into the ice as though something had knelt there to look at something on the ground, was the mark of a hand that was not a human hand and was not a bare paw, and was, when I photographed it and measured it, 14 inches from wrist to fingertip, and had a thumb that sat opposed to the palm, the way a thumb ought to sit, but was longer than my whole forearm. Plenty Cuckoos drove down from the reservation the following afternoon. He was 73 years old at that time, and he had been a friend of my father before he was ever a consultant to the park. And when the region called him and asked if he would come down and look at what we had found, he did not ask any questions on the phone. He arrived at the operations building at 2 in the afternoon in an old Ford truck with a bedroll and a coffee thermos and a canvas bag of tools that he did not open in front of anyone. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the plaster cast Little Robe had poured on the 8th day with 2 bags of Quickset and a hand from a trail crew kid who had never seen a print like that before, and had cried the whole time he was mixing the plaster. He looked at the map with the flags pinned in it where we had found the hat and the radio and the sidearm. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said we needed to bring everyone out of that hollow, and we needed to do it before nightfall, and we needed to close the trails below Beauty Mountain and below Long Point and above the old Kmore bench, and we needed to keep them closed until he could speak with a man named Goes Ahead who lived in Billings and would need 3 days to travel. I asked him why. He looked at me for a long time before he answered. He said, "Because what left those prints has been in this country before, and it does not come to a place unless a place is called it, and when it comes it does not leave until it has taken what it came for." He asked me if Swordbearer had children. I told him one, a boy, 6 years old, in kindergarten in Beckley. He nodded once, and he did not say anything else about that. If you are still with me at this point in the story, and I want to believe you are, take a moment now to press the like button on this video and to leave a comment down below with whatever you are thinking. Because the honest truth is, those small things are what allow me to keep telling stories from this gorge. And if the channel is new to you, please consider subscribing so that whatever I put up next finds its way to you before someone else has to find it. What Plenty Coos told me in the operations building that night, over coffee, with the topographic map spread out on the table and the wind pushing at the windows the way it does in that country in December, is that his grandmother had spoken of a thing that walked the ridges east of the Mississippi in the old days, a thing that his own people did not have a name for because it was not their country, but that they had heard of from the Shawnee and from the Cherokee and from tribes older than either whose names had not survived the last 4 centuries. He said the Shawnee had called it something that translated roughly as the one who watches from the far side of the water. He said the Cherokee had called it something that translated as the tall walker, the one who does not fit through the door. He said his own grandmother had simply called it, when she spoke of it at all, the thing that takes. He said it was not a bear. He said it was not a man. He said it walked upright, and it stood between 7 and 9 feet at the shoulder, and it weighed enough to leave prints in frozen ground that a man weighing 240 pounds could not leave in soft mud. He said it did not come to a place casually. He said it came when a place had been disturbed, when something had been dug up that should not have been dug up, when something had been built where nothing should have been built, when a grave had been walked over often enough that the grave forgot it was a grave. He asked me what had happened in that country in the past 2 years. I told him about the trail work on the Kmore Bench. I told him about the reopening of the old Nuttleburg Tipple to visitors. I told him about the survey the state had run in September along the ridge above Beauty Mountain, cutting a new corridor for a power line. And the crew that had done the cutting had complained about the ground being difficult, about routes that came up wrong, about a place where they had to reroute around a hollow because the survey stakes kept coming out overnight, and the foreman found them the next morning stacked in a neat pile beside the fire ring, tips down, as though something had drawn them out and set them there, and wanted the crew to know it had been done on purpose. Plenty Coos listened to all of it, and he did not write anything down. When I was finished, he said, "You will need to bring me to the hollow above the Kmore Bench in the morning, and you will need to bring Curly with you, and White Calf if he is available, and no one else," he said. "Do not bring your rifles," he said. "If it comes, a rifle will not stop it, and if you shoot at it, you will only make it certain of you, and once it is certain of you, it will not stop until it has you." We left the operations building at 4 the next morning. The temperature had dropped overnight to 11 degrees, and the road up to Cunard was a sheet of black ice for the last mile, and I drove it in low gear with the truck in 4-wheel and Plenty Coos beside me, and Curly and White Calf in the crew cab behind. Curly was the youngest of us at 26, but he had been born on the reservation, and he had learned to track from his grandfather, who had been a hunter of elk before hunting was a thing you did for sport. And he was, I think, the best natural sign reader I have ever worked with in this park, or any park. White Calf was 33, a wildlife tech who had been with us 4 seasons, quiet, careful, a man who could name every plant on the plateau in 3 languages, and who had never once in my hearing raised his voice about anything at all. We parked at the Cunard trailhead at 4:40. The sky was clear. The stars were the way they are in that country in December, hard and close and cold, and there was no moon. We hiked in with headlamps and we did not speak. The old grade above Kmore No. 2 runs on a bench that was cut for the coal trains 110 years ago, and it holds the shape of the mountain the way a scar holds the shape of a wound that never quite closed. It was on that bench, 3 miles in, that Curly stopped. He held up his hand and we stopped behind him, and he pointed at the snow ahead of us, and he did not need to say anything at all. The prints were fresh. They had been made in the last 2 hours. There were 5 of them in the snow on the grade, and they went into the rhododendron on the downhill side, and they were the same 19.5-inch prints we had cast a week ago in the hollow. But these were deeper because the snow was deeper here, and I could see for the first time in a print I had made myself that the toes were long and that there was something like a heavy nail or a claw on the tip of the middle toe that had cut into the snow past the print itself. Plenty Coos knelt beside the third print. He put his hand flat on the snow beside it, not on the print, and he closed his eyes, and he was still for a long time. When he stood up, he said, "It is close," he said. "It has been watching us come up the grade." He said, "We will go slowly now, and we will not turn our backs on the downhill side, and we will not stop to talk, and we will not shine our lamps into the trees." We went another quarter mile. The grade curved around the shoulder of the mountain, and then it dropped into the hollow above the spring where we had found the prints and the handprint the week before. And it was there, in the graying of the sky before dawn, that we heard the first sound. It came from below us. It was not a bear, it was not a coyote, it was not any owl or any bird that lives in that country. It was a low sound that started as a rumble I could feel in my chest before I could hear it in my ears, and it rose into something like a call, a note held for 6 or 7 seconds and then dropping again into the rumble. And when it stopped, the woods were quiet in a way that woods are not usually quiet, and I could hear the blood in my own ears and the small tick of the cooling metal of my headlamp. Curly stopped. He looked at Plenty Coos. Plenty Coos was already looking down the hollow. He said, softly, so softly I almost did not hear him, "It is telling the others we are here." White Calf was behind me, he said, in a whisper. "What others?" Plenty Coos did not answer. He put his hand on my arm and he turned me around to face the way we had come, and he said, "We are going back now. We are going back the way we came. We are not going to run. Do not run. Do not turn your headlamps toward the hollow. Walk." And so we walked, the 4 of us, back up the grade the way we had come, and behind us as we walked I could hear, or I thought I could hear, something moving in the rhododendron on the downhill side, keeping pace with us, not fast, not slow, just moving. It did not follow us all the way to the truck. Somewhere about a half-mile from the trailhead the sound behind us stopped, and after that we heard nothing, and when we reached the truck at 7 in the morning, the sun was just up above the ridge, and the parking area at Kennard was ordinary and cold, and there was a Toyota Tacoma with New Jersey plates parked at the far end that had not been there when we arrived. Plenty Coos looked at the Toyota for a long time. He said, "Whose is that?" I did not know. I called Red Eagle at dispatch, and she pulled the plate on the run. The Toyota belonged to a man named Blackfoot from Newark, New Jersey, a photographer, 61 years old, who had entered the park 3 days earlier on a backcountry permit for the Grandview area, and had told the ranger who issued the permit that he was going to spend a week photographing the old coal camps for a book he was writing about places in the East that had been left behind by the century. He had not checked in for 2 days. The photographer had left his camp at Grandview on the afternoon of December 8th. His tent was still standing when we found it that morning. A 2-person marmot pitched on the flat above the main overlook. The flap zipped, his sleeping bag inside laid open the way a man leaves a bag he means to come back to before nightfall. His stove tucked into its stuff sack beside the fly. His camera missing, his boots missing, his heavy coat gone from the peg he had hammered into the pine beside the tent. The site was clean. There was no sign of a struggle. There was nothing overturned. There was, in the frost on the tent fly, a print the size of my hand pressed into the fabric from the outside in a place where nothing normal should have been able to touch it. 6 feet off the ground, 4 feet in from the edge of the platform. And when I photographed that print and matched it to the plaster cast little Robe had poured a week earlier, I could not tell the difference in the shape of the palm, or in the length of the fingers, or in the depth of the pad below the thumb. Goes Ahead landed at Yeager Airport at 4 that afternoon. He was 79 years old. He had been the head tracker for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Montana for 31 years before he retired, and Plenty Coos had told me on the drive down to the airport that when Goes Ahead said a thing about ground sign it was, in the same way the compass is not a matter of opinion. I picked him up at the arrivals curb in the truck with Plenty Coos riding along, and we drove back to the operations building through the early winter evening, and Goes Ahead did not speak for the first hour of the drive. And then he asked me a single question. He asked me how many prints we had photographed and cast at that point. I told him 17, including the one on the tent fly. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You have more than one." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Prints made by the same foot at the same weight, look the same every time. Prints made by different feet of the same kind, look almost the same, but not exactly." He asked to see the photographs when we got back to the operations building. I laid them out on the table under the fluorescents in the map room, and he went through them for 2 hours with a hand lens and a small ruler, and he separated them into 3 piles. He tapped the first pile. He said, "This one is large, male, full grown." He tapped the second pile. He said, "This one is smaller, female." He tapped the third pile. He said, "This one is smaller still, a young one, not yet full weight." He looked at me across the table. He said, "There are 3 of them." On the morning of December 12th we went in. There were 7 of us. Plenty Coos, Goes Ahead, Curly, White Calf, White Swan, who was our climbing ranger, and who had repelled more of the sandstone in this park than anyone living. Harry Moccasin, who was a backcountry technician and who had been with the park longer than I had, and me. Little Robe stayed at the operations building on the radio with Red Eagle. Crow, our incident commander, ran the perimeter from the trailhead at Cunard with a team of 6 who had been briefed on nothing more than the fact that we were following what we were calling a person of interest into steep ground and would call for extraction if we did not report in by 1500 hours. Goes Ahead had asked us not to bring rifles. We brought pepper spray and radios and a knife each, and nothing else. We went in from the north, down the grade above Kaymore, and we followed the prints of the young one because Goes Ahead said the young one was the least cautious and would lead us to where the adults slept. We tracked for 4 hours. We passed the hollow where we had first heard the sound the week before. We passed the place where the hemlock had been broken in half 12 feet up. We passed a rhododendron thicket where 3 saplings had been twisted together at the top, into a shape that was not the wind, and was not any animal I could name. We came, at about 11 in the morning, to a place where the sandstone rose in a broken cliff above a bench of level ground, and in the base of that cliff was an opening in the rock that was not on any map I had ever seen of this park in 19 years. The opening was 6 feet high and about 4 feet wide, and it went back into the mountain at an angle that took the light after about 10 feet in. There was a shelf of flat rock in front of the opening, and on that shelf, arranged in a careful row, were 7 objects: a hat, a radio, a camera with the strap coiled beside it, a boot with the lace still tied, a jacket folded once, a backpack with the top flap open and empty, and a Glock service pistol with the magazine removed and the slide locked back, and the magazine sitting neatly beside the frame with the rounds counted out on the stone in a straight line beside the magazine, 10 of them, brass gleaming in the late morning light. The objects had been laid out with a care that made my throat close. They had been positioned in an order that was not random. Sword-bearer's hat was on the far left. The photographer's camera was in the middle. On the far right was a rain shell that I did not recognize but that had a name written in permanent marker on the inside of the collar in a woman's hand. And the name was Amanda Wilson, and I remembered then that we had had a hiker reported missing out of Sandstone Falls in October of the previous year, and her name had been Amanda Wilson, and we had searched for her for 6 days and found nothing, and her family had held a memorial service in Beckley in April with no body to bury. I looked at Plenty Coos. He was looking at Goes Ahead. Goes Ahead was looking at the opening in the rock. He said, quietly, without turning his head, "Do not go in there." Something moved in the opening. It was not a shadow. It was too large to be a shadow. It shifted, and it made a sound that was not the sound we had heard on the ridge the week before, but something closer, something breathing, something with a chest large enough to move air the way an idling truck moves air. And White Swan, who was behind me on my left, said, softly, "Oh my God," and I turned my head slowly and I saw it. It was standing at the mouth of the opening. It was not fully in the light. Its head was near the top of the 6-foot opening, but its shoulders had to turn to fit through the width, and its arms hung to the level of its knees, and its face was flat and broad, and its eyes were sunken, and the color of wet stone in a riverbed, and its hair was the color of a wet oak trunk in November, matted with something at the shoulders that might have been mud or might have been blood. or might have been the resin of a pine that had grown up around it while it slept. It was looking at us. It was not moving toward us. It was, I understand now, deciding. Goes Ahead began to speak. He spoke in a language I did not understand, the language of his own people, slowly and steadily, not loud, and his hands were open at his sides, and he did not move his feet. Plenty Coups took a half step forward and joined him. They spoke together, the two of them, one voice underneath the other, and the thing at the mouth of the opening did not move. It watched. Its breath came out of its nose in twin clouds in the cold air, and its chest rose and fell slowly, and it was, in that moment, more patient than anything living I have ever stood in front of. After a long time, and I do not know how long, a minute, 3 minutes, 5, it stepped back into the opening. It did not turn its back on us. It stepped backward, one step, then another, then a third, and then the light did not reach it anymore, and it was gone. Goes Ahead exhaled a breath he had been holding for the whole time. He said, in English, still without turning around, "We are going to leave the shelf as it is. We are going to walk back the way we came. We are going to walk slowly. We are not going to look back over our shoulders." He turned. He walked past me. Plenty Coups followed. The rest of us followed in the order we had come. We walked back the 4 miles to the trailhead. It took us 3.5 hours because the light had begun to fail, and we did not use our lamps until the last mile. Behind us on the ridge above Kmore, at intervals of about 10 minutes, we heard the sound we had heard on the first morning, and each time we heard it, the sound was farther away, and by the time we could see the lights of the perimeter through the trees, the sound was so faint that Curly asked if I still heard it, and I could not honestly answer him. When we came out at Cunard, the sun was low and the truck was where we had left it, and Crow was waiting at the perimeter with her team, and she asked us what we had found, and none of us answered her right away. Plenty Coups spoke to her at last. He said, "We found what took them," he said. "We did not take back what it took," he said. "We are not going to." Crow looked at me for a long moment, and I could not meet her eyes. That was 6 years ago. The trails below Beauty Mountain and above the Kmore bench remain closed. The official reason on the signs is unstable rockfall. The stable rock in that country has not moved in 90 million years. Sword Bearer is still listed as missing and presumed. His widow has remarried a good man from Charleston. His son is 12 now and lives with his mother and stepfather and plays baseball in the spring, and I send a card at Christmas every year, and I have never mailed one of them without sitting with it at my kitchen table for a long time first. The photographer Blackfoot's Toyota is still in the impound lot at Beckley. His sister has called me twice, once in the 2nd year and once in the 4th, and I have told her the truth as far as I am allowed to tell it, which is that we do not know what happened to her brother and that we are sorry. Amanda Wilson's family has never been told what we found on the shelf, and I have not slept an entire night since that morning at the mouth of the opening, and I do not expect to. Goes Ahead died 2 winters ago in Billings, at 89, of a heart that had simply grown tired. Plenty Coups still comes down every March. We drive up to Long Point together, and we sit on the ledge where Curly and I sat on the day he told me the thing about the ground remembering. And we do not speak much, and we watch the gorge. And once, last March, when the fog was rising off the river the way it does when the air over the water is warmer than the air on the plateau, I asked him if he thought it was still there. He looked at me for a long time before he answered. He said, "It is not there in the way you are here," he said, "but it has not gone," he said. "When a place is called it, it comes, and when it comes, it stays until the place stops calling it," he said. "The Kmore bench will stop calling one day, and on that day it will leave, and no one will know it has left, and no one will know it was ever there. And that is the way it has always been in this country, and in every country like it." I did not ask him what would happen if the bench started calling again. I did not have to ask him. That is the part I already know. Sometimes, on the days when I have the radio on and I am driving the long grade back from a survey and the truck is warm and the sky is that pale winter color it gets before a storm, I catch myself listening past the music for a sound that starts as a rumble and rises into a call and drops again into silence. And when I do not hear it, I am relieved for one breath, and then I am afraid for the next. Because a silence in the woods above Kaymore is not an empty thing. A silence in the woods above Kaymore is a thing that is holding its breath, and it will not hold its breath forever. Plenty Coos told me once, when we were sitting in metal folding chairs on the back porch of the Sandstone Visitor Center, listening to freight cars on the CSX line count themselves past midnight, that a new ruin is a wound and an old ruin is a mouth, and I did not know what he meant that summer, but I have thought about the sentence many times in the years since, and I have decided he was warning me. The conveyor at Nuttleburg is 1,485 feet of rusted steel, angled nearly straight up the mountainside from the abandoned tipple on the river to the mine bench at the top of the ridge. And it has stood there since the coal ran out in the middle of the last century, and I have walked its footings more times than I could count. And until October of last year, I would have said I knew every bolt and every fallen crossbeam and every fern that grew out of the concrete pores where the head house used to sit. I have carried the arrowhead patch on my shoulder for 21 years in this district. 70,000 acres of near vertical woodland pinched into the gorge that the New River has cut through the plateau of southern West Virginia over a span of time no human calendar can hold. And my particular territory takes in Nuttleburg and Fayette Station and the long river bench from Cunard down to the base of the bridge. And I know the difference between the sound a black bear makes in the laurels and the sound a boar makes, and the sound a fox in heat makes on a cold night. And I know the difference between a print made by something walking and a print made by something standing still and shifting its weight from one foot to the other while it watched me for however long it needed to watch me before I looked up. I am writing this the way I am writing it because Blackfoot signed the incident closeout under the code we use for confirmed accidental death without recovery of remains, and because Swordbearer had a wife in Charleston who called me on a Tuesday evening in November and asked me straight out what her husband had gone into, and because there are things she deserves to know that I did not put in the file. The morning it started, I came on shift at 7 and Blackfoot had a printed email waiting on my desk from a woman who was worried because her husband, a retired social studies teacher named on the email as Swordbearer, had driven out from Charleston the previous Friday to spend a long weekend at Nuttleburg photographing the coke ovens and had not come home Sunday night as planned, and had not answered his phone since Saturday. Blackfoot was sitting on the corner of the desk with his coffee, and he said, "We have his car at the trailhead lot. The county went out this morning and confirmed. The tag matches. The doors are locked, and there is a large camera bag on the passenger seat, and a topographical map of the Nuttleburg mine complex folded on the dashboard with a pencil line drawn from the conveyor foot up to the mine bench and from there north along the ridge into what he had labeled on the map the seldom seen drainage." Blackfoot said, "I want you to run this one because you know the ground and because you knew his kind," meaning the kind of visitor who reads 3 books about the Nuttleburg Company and drives all the way from Charleston because he has to see the actual ovens with his own eyes. And I said yes without thinking about it, and I regret nothing about saying yes, but I want that on the record. I drove out to the trailhead lot at 8, and Curly was already there in her patrol truck, with the window down and the heater running against the frost, and she is only 26 years old, and only 2 years in the uniform, but her father had been a lineman for Appalachian Power for 30 years. And she knew the woods of this county the way most of us learn to know our own kitchens. She said, "I walked the road grade in about a quarter mile, and I found this." And she held up a plastic evidence bag with a single lens cap in it, the kind that fits a large format field camera. And the cap was clean, but the ground beside the road grade where she had picked it up was not clean, and I asked her to show me. We walked back in together, the 2 of us on the wet gravel of the fire road, with the light coming down through the top branches of the birches and cold shafts, and the river 600 feet below us making its long dragging sound around the bend at Fayette Station, and where she pointed there was a shallow depression pressed into the wet red clay of the bench, and it was a print, and it was too long and too wide, and the toes were too separated, and it was not a bear, and I have looked at bear prints in this district for 2 decades, and this was not one of them. I want to be specific about the print, because specificity is what gets left out of the file, and specificity is what the wife of Swordbearer deserved to have and did not get. It was 17.5 inches from the back of the heel to the front of the leading toe, and it was 9 inches across at the ball of the foot, and there were 5 toes, and they were splayed the way the toes of a foot spread when the whole weight of the body has come down on them in a step, and the imprint was almost 2 full inches deep in the wet clay, in a place where my own boot beside it, and I weigh 210 pounds in the winter, made a mark less than half an inch deep. Curly said quietly, "There is another 130 feet up the grade in the same direction," and I said, "Do not step near it. We are calling this in." I called Crow on the radio from where I stood, and I told her to raise Blackfoot and to put the wildlife district on notice, and to ask White Calf to bring the camera cards down from her station rotation, because there were 3 of her cameras in the Nuttleburg district, and one of them, the one on the mine bench above the head house, would have been looking straight at whatever came down the ridge on Saturday. Crow said back, "Copy," and I heard her keying the other repeater, and while I waited I looked up at the conveyor above me, all 1,485 feet of it, angled into the mountain at that impossible slope. And I saw nothing on it, and I saw nothing beside it. But I felt very clearly that the ridge above me was looking down at me, and had been looking down at me for some time. Goes Ahead came in around 11, and he is 67 years old and retired 6 years ago, and he lives in a cabin above Winona, and he keeps his old service radio charged in the kitchen for exactly these kinds of calls. And Blackfoot had brought him in without telling me, and I was glad. Goes Ahead walked the road grade with me, and looked at the 2 prints without kneeling down beside them, and after a long moment he said, "We had one of these in 1978 above the Kaymore Incline, and we had one of these in 1991 on the ridge above Fern Creek, and we did not put either of them in the file, and I would like a word with you in the truck." In the truck he told me what he had told nobody at the office in 30 years, and what I am not going to write here in full except to say that it explained why the fire road up to the old head house had been quietly decommissioned in 1979, and why the mine adit at the top of the incline had been sealed with the specific kind of concrete pour that the Corps of Engineers used for confined space closures, and not the wire mesh grating that would have been standard for a bat-friendly seal. He also told me the names of the 2 boys who had gone up that ridge in July of 1978, and the name of the seasonal ranger who had gone up after them and had come back down alone with his radio smashed on his belt and his uniform shirt half missing, and had refused to speak for 6 weeks, and had then taken his own release from the service and had moved to Ohio, and the name of the crew chief who had authorized the decommissioning of the fire road in the spring of 1979 over the objection of the interpretive division. And I am not writing any of those 3 names here because 2 of them are still living and one of them is buried in the cemetery above Lansing, and none of them consented to be in a public account. Goes Ahead said, "If White Calf is bringing the cards down, you need to look at them with somebody in the room." And I said, "I hear you." And he said, "And I mean somebody in the room the whole time, not somebody in the room until they step out to take a phone call." And I said again, "I hear you." White Calf came into the operations building at Glen Jean at 1 in the afternoon, with the 3 memory cards in a padded envelope, and we sat in the small conference room, the 4 of us. Blackfoot and Goes Ahead, and White Calf and me, and White Calf loaded the card from the mine bench camera into the reader and pulled up the still frame log first, because the camera is set to save 1 still every hour, whether it detects motion or not. And she scrolled through Saturday morning and stopped at the frame stamped at 11:43, and Swordbearer was in it, walking up the last of the fire road with his large camera hanging from a strap across his chest and his notebook out in his left hand, looking pleased with himself, the way a man looks when he has finally reached a place he has been reading about for 20 years and never expected to actually see. She scrolled forward. At the 12:43 frame he was not in the picture, but the camera had triggered its motion capture and had stayed in continuous mode. And White Calf clicked over to the video log and started it. And there was a full minute of nothing but a wet lens and the sound of wind moving through the birches at the top of the bench. And then at the 50-second mark of the 2nd minute, we saw what came down out of the tree line above the mine bench. And I am going to say only that it was taller than a man on his own 2 feet, and that it moved on its own 2 feet, and that the way it moved through the last of the low laurel at the tree line was not the way any warm-blooded creature I have ever seen in these woods moves through low laurel, and that when it reached the bench and stopped and stood there and turned its head slowly and looked directly at the mounted camera, it lifted 1 long arm, and I asked her to stop the playback before it reached the 3rd minute, and she did. and no one in that room said anything for a long time. And Goes Ahead put his hand flat on the table between us and did not lift it back up until Blackfoot cleared his throat and asked the only question that mattered, which was, how long ago was this? And the timestamp on the video was 51 hours and 18 minutes old. And outside the window of the conference room, the light was already starting to go blue. And Blackfoot said quietly to the four of us in the room, "We are running a live search on this, are we agreed?" And White Calf and I both said yes, and Goes Ahead said, "We are running a search, but if any of your people come back down that fire road after the light starts to change, you make them come down together, and you make them come down loud." We closed the door of the operations building around 3 in the afternoon, and Blackfoot pulled his people into the briefing room the same way he pulls them for a plane crash on the interstate or a spring flood on the Meadow River, meaning without raising his voice and without wasting a syllable. And inside 20 minutes we had a search plan on the whiteboard and a resource list beside it. Little Robe would lead the ground team of 6 up the old fire road from the trailhead to the mine bench, and from the mine bench along the ridge trail north into the seldom-seen drainage. And I would go with him because I knew the drainage, and because Blackfoot did not want 2 teams sharing a radio channel with 2 different lead voices. White Swan would take the 18-foot patrol boat downriver from the Fayette Station takeout and scan the base of the north-facing cliffs and the lower seldom-seen outflow with the good binoculars, because if anything at all had come down off the ridge on the north side, it would have to cross that outflow to reach the river, and if it had crossed at any point in the last 3 days, there would be sign in the mud. Harry Moccasin would go up in the state police helicopter as observer with the thermal camera because there were still 5 hours of good light and the drainage was too tight to fly close to the ridge, and we needed his eyes at 400 feet. Not 4,000. Crow would hold dispatch at Glen Jean, and Blackfoot would relay to the region from operations, and Red Eagle, who is our chief of law enforcement and who has been present at more incident closeouts in this park than any of us wish to think about, would stage at the trailhead with a marked cruiser and a shotgun in the rack, because the county sheriff wanted a uniformed presence at the vehicle in case the wife drove out from Charleston. White Calf would stay at operations with the video card, and Goes Ahead would sit with her, and neither one of them argued about that assignment. We moved out at 3:30. The fire road up to the mine bench at Nuttleburg is a 1.5 miles of loose grade running along a bench cut into the north wall of the gorge, and it climbs 800 vertical feet in that distance, and I have walked it in every weather, and on that Monday afternoon it was cold and wet, and smelling of iron from the ore rot that leaches out of the exposed cuts, and Little Robe walked point and I walked second, and the 4 others behind us walked in a spread column with 3 yards between them, the way he had drilled them since spring. 200 yards up we came to the first of the prints Curly had marked with the crime scene tape she had strung on hardwood saplings, and Little Robe stopped at the tape and put both hands on his hips and looked at the print for a long time and said only, "That was not made hurrying." 400 yards further up the grade we found a page torn from a small pocket notebook, folded once, sitting on a moss-covered rail tie beside the road, and the page had a pencil sketch on it of the coke ovens in cross-section, drawn from what would have been the position of somebody standing on the fire road roughly where we were standing, and Little Robe photographed it and bagged it and did not remove it. 600 yards up we passed the third of the prints Curly had marked, and beside that print, half buried in a drift of yellow leaves at the edge of the grade, we found a padded lens hood the size of my palm and the color of army canvas, and inside the hood, still snapped in place around the front thread, was the filter that would have been screwed onto the front of a large landscape lens, and the filter was intact, and the glass was clean, and Little Robe photographed it and bagged it, and did not remove it. 700 yards up, at the last switchback before the bench, the 4 seasonals behind us stopped, without being told to stop, and when I turned around to see why they had stopped, I saw that all 4 of them were looking up the slope above the fire road at something in the trees I could not see from where I was standing. And Little Robe said quietly, "What are you looking at?" And the youngest of the 4, a man of about 23 who had come to us from a summer with the trail crew at Great Smoky, said, "Sir, I do not know." And Little Robe said, "Then keep moving." And the man moved. At the 800-yard mark, the fire road bends left through a cut and comes out onto the mine bench proper. And the bench is a flat shelf, maybe 120 yards long and 40 yards deep at its widest. And the head house foundations sit at the near end, and the sealed adit sits at the far end, and the top of the conveyor comes into the bench roughly in the middle, and we came out of the cut and onto the bench, and I saw immediately that the second camera on the bench, the one white calf, had not been able to reach that morning because it was mounted 12 feet up a hickory near the sealed adit, had been pulled down and was lying in 3 pieces beside the trunk of the tree, and the shattered housing had been ground into the mud by something heavy standing on it. I told Blackfoot on the radio. He asked me to describe it and I did. He asked me to hold position and I did. We stood on that bench for 4 full minutes in complete stillness, all 6 of us, and I listened. And what I want you to understand about that afternoon is that the ridge above the mine bench was quiet in a way that no piece of these mountains is ever quiet, meaning no crows and no jays and no squirrels moving in the leaf litter and no wind in the top of the hickories, and the only sound I could hear was the CSX freight 2 miles below us on the river working its long tonnage past the base of the gorge, and the river itself, faint. Little Robe said quietly, "We have 2 hours of good light. We go to the outflow and we come back," and I said, "Agreed." We crossed the bench with our hands on our sidearms and we went up the ridge trail north into the seldom seen drainage, and the drainage is not on any of the visitor maps and it is barely a trail. It is a game path along the top of the ridge that drops down through a series of stepped ledges into the head of the seldom seen creek, and we went in 400 yards, and the man at the back of the column, one of Little Robe's seasonals whose name I will not put in this account, said clearly on the open channel, "Somebody is walking behind us." Little Robe held up his fist and we all stopped and we listened, and I heard it too. Footfalls, not human ones, slow, wide-spaced, placed with attention, coming down the ridge to our left, uphill from us, about 40 yards off in the laurel. And I have been in this park for 21 years, and I have been walked beside by black bears more than once, and I have been circled by boar, and I have had a bobcat cross a trail 6 feet in front of me at dawn, and I know what those things sound like when they walk. And this was not any of those things. What it sounded like was a man in heavy boots trying to place his feet quietly in wet leaves, and failing because he weighed too much for the ground he was standing on, except a man weighs less than what was making that sound. I want to take one line right here, before I tell you the rest, to ask you to hit the like button on this video, and to leave a comment telling me the name of the county you are watching from, and to subscribe to this channel, so that when the next account comes off these ridges I am able to reach you with it, because these stories are told by rangers and for rangers, and the only reason I have been able to keep telling them is because you have kept listening. Now, back to that ridge above the drainage. We stood there for what my watch later told me was 2 minutes and 11 seconds, and the footfalls came down the slope to within what I would estimate was 25 yards, and then they stopped, and then the smell reached us. And I will tell you what my mother's cousin, who worked at a rendering plant outside Beckley for 30 years, once told me the smell of that plant was. And it was that smell. And then the sound that came out of the laurel was not a growl, and was not a howl, and was not a whistle, but was something between the three. And it was pitched somewhere at the low edge of what my ears could hear. And it lasted perhaps 4 seconds. And every man in that column took 1 step backwards without being told to. Little Robe said on the radio, "We are withdrawing to the bench." And Crow said back, "Copy, withdrawing to bench." And we walked out of that drainage the way you walk out of a room where somebody is sleeping, and we did not run. And when we reached the mine bench, Harry Moccasin was on the radio from the helicopter overhead saying, "I have a heat return on the ridge above your position, large, holding still. Do you want me to close?" And Little Robe said, "Negative, do not close. Hold at 400 and mark the coordinate." We came down the fire road in the last of the light with our sidearms drawn, and nobody said anything to anybody else. And when we reached the trailhead, Red Eagle was standing beside his cruiser with the shotgun out of the rack and across his forearm, and he looked at each of our faces in turn and did not ask any questions. That was Monday. White Swan came in from the river at 9 that evening with the patrol boat winched onto the trailer at Fayette Station, and she came into the operations building without knocking and set her sunglasses on the counter and said only, "There is a place at the base of the seldom seen outflow where the mud has been walked through from the ridge side to the river and back to the ridge side, and I wanted on the record that I saw it, and I wanted on the record that I did not put my boat in for a closer look because the light was going and because I was alone on the water." And Blackfoot signed the note beside her name and did not ask her to elaborate. On Tuesday morning we went back up with a team of 12, 4 of them from the Bluestone district and 2 of them from the Golly office. And we walked the fire road, and we walked the mine bench, and we walked the ridge trail into the seldom seen drainage as far as the first step ledge, and we found nothing. No more prints, no more sign, no more anything. And the wildlife camera that had been pulled down from the hickory was still there in 3 pieces, where it had been the day before, but the mud around it had been walked over so many times by so many boots by the end of the second day, that any print that might have been there was gone. White calf and goes ahead, and I sat with the video from the mine bench camera for 3 more days, and we did not put what was on it into any file that would be readable by anyone outside the 4 of us. On Wednesday of the following week, the Corps of Engineers came out and put a fresh concrete pour on the sealed adit at the top of the mine bench, and they added a second seal 30 yards inside the adit at the first air shaft, and the paperwork listed the work as a bat exclusion project. The following Tuesday evening, the wife of Swordbearer called me at the operations building, and I answered, because I always answer when the number is not familiar. And she said her name, and I said my condolences, and she asked me what her husband had gone into. I told her I did not know. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said, "My husband spent 32 years in a classroom teaching children about places like the one he drove out to see on Friday, and he did not go there because he was reckless. He went there because he loved it, and I would like you to promise me that the file you signed says the same thing." I told her the file says he was an experienced backcountry visitor who left the marked trail in pursuit of a subject of documented historical interest and encountered an unrecoverable circumstance, and that his memory would be honored on the interpretive placard at the trailhead at the beginning of the next season. And that is what the file says, and it is not a lie, and it is not the whole truth. And she was quiet again. And then she said thank you, and then she hung up, and I sat at my desk for a long time with the phone still in my hand. That was not the whole truth, and I have thought about it every day since, and I am telling the rest of it here because Plenty Coos was right. A new ruin is a wound, and an old ruin is a mouth, and the mouth at Nuttleburg has been open for 120 years, and something has been inside it for longer than that, and we have been feeding it by pretending it was not there. Goes Ahead retired a second time after that fall, and he does not come to the office anymore, and Blackfoot has closed 3 more files in the same code since October, and I will not name the trails they were on. And Curly asked me last week if she could transfer to Bluestone, and I signed the paper the same day. If you are watching this and you are planning to come to New River Gorge, come. It is one of the great places on this earth, and hike Endless Wall and the Long Point Trail and the Grand View Overlook, and stand on the bridge at Fayette Station and look down at the river running 600 feet below, and be off the ridge before the light starts to go blue, and stay on the mapped trails. And if you are ever on a fire road at 11 in the morning and the birds have stopped and the woods have gone still around you, walk out. Do not turn around. Do not look up. Walk the way you came, and keep walking. And when you get to your car, drive, and do not stop until you are on the interstate, and do not tell anybody at the office what you heard. Because the mouth is patient, and it has been patient for a very long time, and it does not need you to feed it. It only needs you not to name it. And if you are still here, still with me, at the end of this telling, then you already know the name I am not saying, and you already know why I am not saying it, and that is enough, and we are done. The last transmission Blackfoot ever sent came in at 0417 on the morning of October the 9th, and the 22 seconds of it that the dispatch tape at the Glen Jean Operations Building captured are still archived on a locked shelf in the equipment room at the back of the building, and I have listened to that recording 11 times over the 7 years since it was made. And every time I listen to it, I hear a different thing in the last 4 seconds. And every time I stop the tape and rewind it, I have to sit down for a minute at the desk beside the coffee machine and remind myself that I am in an office building in southern West Virginia in the year the file was closed, and not on the mine bench above the Fern Creek drainage in the 10th minute of a call that I should never have accepted responsibility for. I have carried the arrowhead patch on my shoulder for 22 years in the New River Gorge, and I have written more incident reports than I can count in that time, and I am telling you now that the report I signed on Blackfoot in the second week of October 7 years ago was the only one I ever signed, knowing it was not what had happened. The gorge itself is 53 miles of the New River cutting a canyon 1,000 feet deep through the Allegheny Plateau of southern West Virginia. More than 70,000 acres of near-vertical woodland and abandoned coal camps and mine benches where the concrete pours still stand, and the rails have been pulled up and the rhododendron has come in over everything the way scar tissue comes in over a bone. Blackfoot was a contract wildlife photographer working under a permit Whitecalf had written 6 weeks earlier for a black bear denning study out of the Sandstone office, and he had been running a camera trap grid on the north-facing slope above the Fern Creek confluence for 11 days when the call came in. He was 51 years old, ex-Army Signal Corps with 2 tours in the mid-90s, on his second marriage, no children, and he had done contract camera work for the Park Service in 4 regions over the previous decade, with an exemplary record and a reputation among the wildlife techs for finishing what he started even when the weather went bad on him. I want to make that clear at the beginning, because the man who did the final report from the region office wrote about Blackfoot as though the disappearance was a case of a photographer wandering off in poor conditions and getting himself into trouble. And I want to say now, on this recording, that Blackfoot was not that kind of contractor. He was careful, he was slow, he wrote everything down. He carried 2 radios, a primary and a backup, and he kept both of them charged, and he checked them every night before he slept in his truck at the trailhead. He filed his location with dispatch every morning at 0600 and every evening at 1800 without fail for the 11 days he had been on the study before the 9th. I have his logbook. It is still in the same locked drawer as the tape. The last entry in the logbook is from the evening of the 8th, and it reads, "Moving north pair up to shelf tomorrow. Moon 3/4, wind light out of the southwest. Deer sign heavy on the bench. Something is bothering the herd. Will note further in morning entry." That is the last thing he ever wrote. The Fern Creek drainage itself is one of the more remote pockets of the park. It comes off the north-facing wall of the gorge about 8 miles upriver from the Sandstone Falls put in, and it drops fast through a series of small unnamed cascades before it joins the New River just below the rapids at Sewell, and the trail up from the river bottom is a decommissioned mine road that has been closed to vehicles since the late 70s and that has been slowly reclaimed by the second growth in the decades since. The mine bench is a coal-era artifact, a flat cut into the slope at about 1,800 feet of elevation where the tipple used to stand. And above the bench, the ground rises steeply through 2 cliff bands and levels out at the shelf where Blackfoot had planned to reposition the north pair of cameras. The night before he disappeared, Whitecalf received an email from his study laptop that said only, "Activity at 3 of the 6 cameras between 2 and 3 a.m. Something is spooking the deer, and I am going to move the north pair to the shelf above the Kmore bench in the morning." That email came in at 11:47 at night on October the 8th. Nobody heard from him again until 0417 the next morning, when he keyed his radio for 22 seconds from a position that the dispatchers at Glen Jean could not lock down. I want to describe what was on the tape, but I want to describe it in the order that we heard it, because the order matters. The first 8 seconds of the transmission were pure carrier static, which is what a radio sounds like when the key is held down and the transmitting operator is not saying anything. In the middle of that 8 seconds you can hear his breathing. It is not fast. It is not the breathing of a man who is running. It is the breathing of a man who is trying to hold still and to hold his lungs quiet. After the 8 seconds of carrier static, he says one sentence, and he says it very quietly, and the sentence is, "I am on the shelf above the Fern Creek bench, and there is something down the slope from me that I do not know what it is." Then there are 2 seconds of silence, and then a sound comes in over the carrier that is not a word and not a voice as I understand voices, and it is on the tape for 4 seconds, and after those 4 seconds the transmission ends. Red Eagle was on dispatch that night. She is the one who took the call, and she is the one who logged it, and she is the one who tried for 40 minutes to raise Blackfoot back on the frequency and failed. She called Harry Moccasin at his cabin in Oak Hill at 0502 because he was the backcountry ranger on standby, and he lived closest to the Fern Creek trailhead. And Harry Moccasin arrived at the trailhead at 0538 and radioed in that Blackfoot's truck was still parked there and the driver door was unlocked and the notebook Blackfoot always kept on the passenger seat was open to a page from earlier that evening, on which he had written a checklist for the camera moves he had planned for the morning. I need to pause here and say something to any of you who have been following these accounts on this channel and who have not yet clicked the like button or subscribed or left a note in the comments, and that is that these recordings are the only version of these files that exist outside the region office. And the way this channel keeps going is that you keep coming back to it, and the way you keep coming back is that the numbers hold up, and it takes about 10 seconds to hit the like, subscribe, and comment. It is the difference between whether an account like this reaches somebody who needs to hear it, or whether it sits on a shelf like the tape at Glen Jean. I would appreciate it if you took those 10 seconds now. Back to the report. By 07:15, Swordbearer was in the Sandstone conference room activating the incident response protocol. And by 08:30, he had called me at my house in Fayetteville and told me I was operations chief on the search. Swordbearer is chief ranger of the district, and he has held that position for 11 years, and I do not take direction from him lightly, and I do not decline it lightly either. And when he called me that morning, I understood from the tone of his voice that this was not a routine missing person, and I asked him only what resources I could pull, and he said, "Whatever you need. Take White Calf and Curly and White Swan and Little Robe as the initial team. Get Crow on the phone if you need him. Do not call the region until we have something to tell them." Crow retired from the Park Service 4 years earlier after a 29-year career in this gorge and in the Cumberland Gap District before that, and he had walked more miles of the New River Corridor than anyone I have ever known. And I called him at 10:05 that morning, and he was at the Sandstone office by 11:30 with his old radio harness on and a topographic map of the Fern Creek drainage that had lines drawn on it in pencil that I did not recognize. When I asked him what those lines were, he said, "Those are the places I do not walk anymore," and he did not elaborate. By noon, we had a team of 9 on the trailhead. White Calf had gone up ahead with Harry Moccasin to secure the vehicle scene and to lay a hasty grid on the ridge, and Curly was reading sign on the trail up from the parking lot, and White Swan was rigging a rappel line on the cliff band below the shelf, and Little Robe was on radio relay from the trailhead, because the coverage on the ridge above Fern Creek is bad and gets worse the higher you go. I walked in with Crow, and we followed the trail up through the second growth oak and the rhododendron tunnels along the creek, and we came out onto the mine bench about a mile in, and Curly was there kneeling in the wet clay at the edge of the trail, with his hand held out flat to keep the rest of us back. When Curly does that, you stop. Curly is Blackfoot Confederacy on his mother's side, and he grew up on a ranch in northern Montana, and he has been tracking for the Park Service for 16 years, and he does not spook, and he does not overcall. I stopped at his hand, and I looked past him at the ground where he was looking, and I saw a print pressed into the wet clay of the bench. And I want to be careful here about what I say because the region office was very specific in the aftermath about what could be documented and what could not. And the print I am about to describe never made it into a photograph that was signed for by an evidence officer, and it never made it into the file. The print was oriented up the slope. It was 17 inches from the back of the heel to the tip of the longest toe. It was almost 8 inches across at the ball. There were 5 toes, and the toes were splayed wide apart from each other in a way that a boot does not splay them, and in a way that a bear does not either. And the impression of the toes was as deep as the impression of the heel, which meant the weight was distributed along the entire foot in a way that indicated a plantigrade gait and not a digitigrade one. I have seen bear tracks in this district for 2 decades. This was not a bear. Crow crouched next to Curly, and he looked at the print for a long time, and he did not say anything. And after a while he stood up and he walked 20 feet up the trail, and he crouched again at another print. And then he walked another 30 feet and he crouched again. And by the time he came back to us, his face had a set to it I had only seen once before. The summer we pulled a body out of the Cunard Rapids, and he said, "This thing walked up this bench in a straight line last night, and it was not in a hurry, and it did not care who saw its prints." He pulled the folded topographic map out of his jacket and he opened it on a flat piece of sandstone at the edge of the trail, and he pointed to the pencil lines I had asked him about earlier. There were 7 of them on the map, thin gray marks running along ridges and drainages in the Fern Creek area, and further west toward Cunard, and further north toward the Kmore Bench. And he said, "These are the places I have found this same sign in the 29 years I worked this district, and I never wrote any of it up because there was nowhere in a report form to put what I was writing about, and I did not want to be the ranger who did that. And now I am going to give this map to you. And I want you to keep it in a place that is not the operations building at Glen Jean, because if the region office ever asks about this case in 5 years or 10 years, I do not want this map to be part of what they ask about. He folded the map and he handed it to me, and I put it inside my jacket without looking at it further. Curly asked him a question in a low voice, and I did not hear what the question was. And Crow answered him in the same low voice, and I did not hear the answer. And then Curly stood up and shook the wet clay off his gloves and said, "We should keep moving. The light will not hold past 4:30 on this slope." I asked him what he thought, and he did not answer me. And instead he said, "We need to get to where Blackfoot keyed the radio before the light goes." The shelf above the Fern Creek bench sits at about 2,600 feet of elevation, and it is a narrow strip of relatively flat ground between the top of the last cliff band and the beginning of the ridge crest. And it is about 1.25 miles above where we found the prints, and it took us until 3 in the afternoon to get up there, because the route required rigging fixed lines in 2 places, and because Curly kept stopping to look at sign along the way, and White Swan set the first line off a hemlock at the base of the lower cliff band, and the second off a piece of bare sandstone 30 feet higher, and she worked in complete quiet with the precision of somebody who has done technical rescue in this district for 11 years, and who does not need to talk while she is working. And Little Robe belayed from the ground, and Hairy Moccasin cleared the loose stone above her before she went up, and the whole operation of getting the team up those 2 pitches took the better part of an hour. And by the time we came up onto the shelf, the light was already turning the color that light turns in an Appalachian gorge in October, which is a kind of copper going toward slate. And White Calf had already been on the shelf for an hour with Hairy Moccasin, and she was standing at the edge of a stand of hemlocks with her arms crossed and her radio in her hand, and she was not looking at us when we came up. She was looking downslope. I want to describe the shelf because the layout of it matters. It is about 80 yards long and 30 yards wide, and it is bordered on the uphill side by a rise of about 15 feet up to the ridge crest, and on the downhill side by a drop of about 40 feet to the top of the last cliff band. And there is a stand of old-growth hemlock at the eastern end of it, and it was toward that stand that White Calf was looking when we walked up. She said, without turning to face me, "I want you to come with me, and I want the rest of the team to hold position here." I told Crow and Curly and White Swan to hold, and I walked with White Calf into the hemlocks. The shelf underfoot was strange to walk on. I have walked a lot of high ground in this park in 22 years, and the ground on that shelf did not feel like the ground on the ridges around it. The moss on the stones was flattened in places where nothing should have flattened it. The needles under the hemlocks lay in patterns that suggested a very slow and deliberate movement of a heavy body through them at some point in the previous 48 hours. The air smelled of something I could not put a name to, and still cannot. An animal smell, but not any animal smell I know. Something between wet dog and river silt and the inside of a wall in an old house. And the smell did not lift when the wind came up. And after a while I stopped noticing it and started only noticing that I was breathing shallowly without meaning to. About 15 feet in, she stopped, and she pointed at a tree, and hanging in the fork of the tree, at about 7 feet off the ground, was Blackfoot's camera. It was not thrown there. It was placed. The strap was looped once around the branch behind the fork in a way that a strap does not loop by accident, and the lens cap was on, and the camera was set to off, and it was clean of mud, and there was nothing else in the tree. White Calf said, "We have not touched it. We have not moved it. We have photographed it in place, and we have photographed the tree from 4 angles, and I want you to look at it in place before we take it down." I looked at it for a long time. I said, "Where is his pack?" She said, "The pack is 30 yards further into the hemlocks, and it is intact, and everything is inside it, including his phone and his wallet and his water bottle and the checklist for the morning's camera moves." I said, "Where are the cameras he was going to move?" She said, "The north pair of cameras are gone from the position on the ridge where he was going to move them, and they are not on the shelf, and they are not on the trail, and they are not anywhere we have looked." I asked her what she was not saying, and she took a long breath and she said, "We pulled the SD card from the camera in the tree. We hold it in the hand, and we walked back out to the group, and Little Robe came up from below with Hairy Moccasin, because we needed everybody to hear this at once, and White Calf plugged the SD card into her field laptop, and she pulled up the last file on the card, and it was a video, and it was 3 minutes and 11 seconds long, and it had been recorded starting at 03:58 on the morning of October the 9th, which was 19 minutes before Blackfoot's radio transmission came into Glen Jean. I am not going to describe the whole video, because there are things on it that I do not want to say out loud on this recording, but I will describe the parts that were entered into the discussion at the shelf that afternoon. The video starts in near total lightless conditions with only the ambient light of a partial moon coming through the canopy, and it is filmed handheld, and the operator is breathing quietly and moving very slowly across the shelf toward the edge above the Kmore drop. For the first minute nothing happens except that the camera pans slowly across the tree line to the south, and you can hear the wind in the hemlocks, and you can hear the creek in the bottom of the drainage a long way below, and you can hear Blackfoot breathing. At 1 minute and 8 seconds into the video, the audio changes. There is a sound that comes in from the south, from downslope, and it is a low sound, and it is not a mechanical sound, and it is not a wind sound, and it is not the sound of any animal I have ever recorded in this district in 22 years. It is a sound that sits at the bottom of your hearing and pushes against something in your chest that is not quite your lungs. Little Robe put her hand on her chest when she heard it play back. That sound goes on for 11 seconds. When it stops, Blackfoot whispers, very quietly, into the microphone that is built into the camera housing, and he says, "I do not think it is a bear." Then there is another minute of silence and slow panning during which nothing is visible except the outlines of the trees against the sky. And then, at 2 minutes and 31 seconds, something walks across the frame at the top of the video, up on the ridge crest above the shelf, and it walks upright. And it walks smoothly, and it does not stop, and it is on the frame for 4 seconds, and then it is gone. I have watched a lot of wildlife camera footage in my time in the Park Service, and I have watched a lot of it slowed down and stabilized in software, and I am telling you that what walked across the top of the frame in that 4 seconds was not a person. It was too tall. It was walking on ground that was 7 feet higher than the shelf, and its head was above the branches of the hemlocks that were rooted on the shelf, and those hemlocks were at least 30 feet tall. It did not swing its arms the way a person swings arms. It carried its arms low and slightly bent, and the arms moved in time with the legs in a way that a person's arms do not move. It did not look at the camera. I want that to be understood. It walked past. It did not look. The last 30 seconds of the video are Blackfoot moving slowly backward toward the hemlocks with the camera pointed up at the ridge crest. And at the very end of the video, in the last 3 seconds, the sound comes back, and it is louder, and it is closer, and then the recording ends. Whitecalf closed the laptop. Nobody said anything for a while. I looked at Crow, and Crow was looking downslope, and he was rubbing the back of his neck the way he does when he is thinking about something he does not want to say. And after a minute, Goes Ahead came up on the radio from the operations building at Glen Jean, because Swordbearer had put him on standby to advise, and Goes Ahead is the oldest ranger still associated with this district, and he retired in '98, and he was a boy in the Blackfeet country before he came east. And I told him what we had, and I did not describe the video in detail on the radio because I did not want it going into the log. And Goes Ahead was quiet for a long time, and then he said only, "Come off that shelf tonight. Take your team down before the light finishes, and mark the shelf on the map so no one goes back up until Plenty Coos can come and walk it." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Plenty Coos is at his sister's house in Browning, and I have already called him, and he is driving. Do not stay on that shelf. Get your team off." We came off the shelf. I want to say we came off it because we finished our work and secured the scene and preserved the evidence, but that is not the only reason. We came off it because when the sun dropped behind the ridge above us, the shelf went quiet in a way that a place in the Appalachians does not go quiet in October. The insects stopped. The wind stopped. Curly and Crow and I were the last 3 on the shelf, and we came down the fixed lines with our headlamps on, and I do not remember any of us speaking. Plenty Coos arrived at Glen Jean on the morning of the 11th. He came into the operations building in a canvas jacket with a small leather bag over his shoulder, and he asked to see the map, and he asked to hear the audio, and he asked me and Crow and Curly to walk him up to the shelf. We took him up the next day. He walked the shelf for 2 hours in complete silence, and he crouched at the edge of the hemlocks where the camera had been in the tree, and he crouched at the position where Blackfoot had recorded the video, and he walked the ridge crest above the shelf where the figure had passed. And when we came back down to the base of the fixed lines, he sat on a log for a long time, and he did not look at any of us. And finally he said, in the language his grandmother had taught him, and then in English so we would understand, "This is a place where one of the mountain walkers came through the night the photographer was here, and the photographer saw it, and it saw that he had seen it, and it did not want to be seen, and it did what it does when it does not want to be seen." He did not say what that was. He said, "Do not put cameras up here again. Do not send anybody up here to look for him. He is not on this shelf. He is not on this ridge. He is where the mountain walkers take those who see them, and I do not know where that is, and I do not know a man alive who does." The file was closed 6 weeks later as an unresolved missing person case, presumed drowning in the Fern Creek drainage during a nighttime navigation error. The radio transmission was attributed to equipment malfunction. The video from the SD card was not entered into evidence. The card itself is in the same locked drawer at Glen Jean as the dispatch tape. Swordbearer signed the report. I signed the report. Crow refused to sign it and retired the following spring and moved to a house in Beckley where he lives now with his second wife and does not answer his phone when I call. Curley transferred out of the district in the spring and took a tracking position in the Big South Fork district in Tennessee. White Calf finished her degree and left the Park Service. White Swan is still in this district. Harry Moccasin retired last year. Little Robe is a district ranger in the Great Smokies now. Red Eagle still works dispatch at Glen Jean, and she still has the tape on her shelf. Plenty Coos died 2 winters ago at his sister's house in Browning. Goes Ahead lives at the Veterans Home in Beckley, and he does not talk about the case. I go up to the Fern Creek Trailhead once a year on the 9th of October. I do not go past the parking lot. I sit in my truck for a while, and I look up at the ridge, and I listen to the creek, and I go home. Last year, in the 3rd year I did this, at about 04:17 in the morning, sitting in my truck with the window cracked and the heater running low, I heard something down the slope from the parking lot that I have not been able to explain to myself. I did not report it. I drove home. I have not been back yet this year. I do not know if I am going to go. The park ledger records 8 persons entering the New River Gorge backcountry on the morning of October 7th. The ledger does not record what came out of that basin, and it does not record the sounds we heard on the second night, and it does not record why the 8th signature is smudged where a hand had shaken as it wrote. I was the 9th. I was the one who signed everyone in, who checked the permits, who counted the packs and the food and the water and the emergency beacons. And I was the one who walked at the front with the topographic map folded into my shirt pocket and a service radio clipped to the strap of my pack. It was my job to bring them out. 7 of them came back. The group had been in planning for almost a year before I ever met them at the trailhead at Fayetteville. They were a cultural preservation team assembled from 3 affiliated nations, sent to the gorge to document a series of stone alignments and old trail markers that had been reported by hikers along the ridge above the river. The alignments were rumored to be older than the park itself, older than the state, older than the coal towns that had risen and collapsed and been swallowed back by rhododendron. The Park Service had approved the survey under the condition that a ranger accompanied the party at all times. That ranger was me. I met them on the gravel lot at 6 in the morning under a sky the color of iron shavings. Plenty Coo stepped out of the first truck. He was 71 years old and moved like a man half that age, with a woven blanket folded over one shoulder and a walking staff of polished ash in his right hand. He shook my hand and said nothing at first, only looked past me toward the tree line where the mist was rising off the ferns. When he did speak, it was to introduce the others as they climbed out of the 2 vans behind him. Crow, 34, the historian who had led the grant application, tall and lean with hair pulled back in a single braid. White Calf, 26, the tracker, quiet, with eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. Red Eagle, 42, the photographer, carrying 2 heavy cases of camera equipment and a tripod strapped across his back. Swordbearer, 38, broad across the shoulders, who took the largest pack without being asked. Little Robe, 19, the apprentice, the youngest of the group, bright and nervous, and already asking questions before we had even started walking. Blackfoot, 47, the navigator, who unfolded a battered map on the hood of my truck and asked me to confirm the coordinates of our first waypoint. Curly, 51, who would be our camp keeper and cook, moving with the calm certainty of a man who had done this exact work in 100 wild places. Goes ahead, 29, the forward scout, already lacing his boots tighter and glancing at the tree line like a man impatient to be moving. White Swan, 33, our medic, a small woman with a hard mouth and a heavy kit slung across her back. Hairy Moccasin, 44, who said the least of all of them, whose face had the stillness of stone, who at the trailhead sign paused and touched 2 fingers to the wood before he stepped past it. I did not ask him what that meant. I wish I had. We started up the trail at 6:30. The gorge in October has a particular smell. Wet oak leaves and cold river water and something mineral that comes off the sandstone cliffs when the sun has not yet found them. The trail follows an old logging grade for the first 2 miles, then breaks off into a spur that climbs steeply toward the ridge. We were making for a saddle above Wolf Creek, a place that did not appear on the tourist maps and that the survey team had located from an old photograph in a state archive. The photograph had been taken in 1912 by a coal company surveyor who had marked a series of standing stones on the ridge and had written a single note in the margin of his field journal. The note said, in cramped and hurried handwriting, that no member of his crew would return to that place after the second day. Crow had shown me the photograph the week before over coffee in Beckley. He had asked me if I had ever heard anything strange from that ridge. I had told him the truth, which was that in 9 years as a ranger in the gorge I had heard many strange things, most of which had rational explanations. I did not tell him about the wood knocks I had heard one November night at a fire tower 2 ridges south, or about the smell that had come through my tent in the summer of my second year, a smell like a wet dog left in a hot car. I had learned by then not to mention such things to visitors. Visitors either laughed at you or believed you too eagerly, and both were problems. By 10 in the morning we had left the maintained trail behind and were pushing through a corridor of mountain laurel that closed over our heads and forced us into single file. Goes Ahead moved 20 yards ahead of the main group, his machete tapping softly on the trunks as he passed. Behind him came Blackfoot with the map, then Plenty Coues walking with a steadiness that put the rest of us to shame, then Crow, then Red Eagle with his cameras, then White Calf and Little Robe together, then Sword Bearer and Curly with the heavy packs, then White Swan, then Hairy Moccasin at the rear. I moved up and down the line, checking the pace, watching for signs of fatigue in the older members, listening to the woods. The woods on that ridge were not quiet in the way that comforts a person. They were quiet in the way that suggests something has stopped speaking because something else has entered the room. There were no jays, there were no crows. The only sound was the tap of the machete somewhere ahead of us and the soft scrape of boots on stone. I noticed it around 11. I looked back to see if Hairy Moccasin had noticed it too, and I found him already looking at me. He nodded once, slowly, and I felt something cold turn over in my stomach. We reached the first waypoint just before noon. It was a clearing about the size of a small house, floored with moss and ringed with hemlocks, and in the center of it stood a stone. The stone was roughly the height of a man, tapered at the top, and set into the ground with such precision that even after a century of frost it had not tilted. Around the base of it were smaller stones arranged in a spiral pattern that only became visible when you climbed up onto a fallen log at the edge of the clearing and looked down. Red Eagle set up his tripod and photographed the stone from 6 angles, while Blackfoot recorded compass bearings, and Plenty Coues walked a slow circle around the clearing, his lips moving. Crow stood beside me with a notebook open and asked me, quietly, if I had ever been to this spot before. I told him I had not. I had walked the ridge above and the creek below, but this clearing had not been on any map I had used, and I could not remember passing it. He wrote something in his notebook and did not show me what it was. We ate lunch at the edge of the clearing while Plenty Coues spoke with Little Robe about the arrangement of the smaller stones. He was explaining that the spiral pattern was consistent with certain star alignments that had been recorded by his grandfather's generation. and that the direction of the opening in the spiral pointed toward what would have been the rising of a particular star 2 centuries earlier. Little Robe was listening the way a person listens to a story he has waited his whole life to hear. I sat with my back to the hemlocks and ate a granola bar and watched Harry Moccasin, who had not eaten yet, who was standing at the far edge of the clearing with his hand resting on the trunk of a tree and his eyes on the slope above. We packed up at 1 and continued along the spur toward the next waypoint, which lay about 2 miles further on and required a descent into a shallow draw and a climb up the far side. It was on that descent that Goes Ahead came back down the trail at a run. He had not shouted. That was the first thing I noticed. A man who runs down a mountain trail toward his party is usually shouting a warning. Goes Ahead was silent, and his silence was worse than any shout could have been. He came up to me and to Crow, and he said, in a low voice that did not carry beyond the three of us, that he had found something on the trail ahead, and that we should come and see it before we brought the rest of the party through. I told Blackfoot to hold the group at a wide bend in the trail. Then Crow and I followed Goes Ahead up the slope. The thing on the trail was a print. It was pressed deep into a patch of wet clay where a small seep crossed the path. It was longer than my boot by half again, and it was wider at the ball than any human foot I had ever measured. The toes were splayed and heavy, and at the heel there was a raised ridge where the weight had rocked forward as the thing walked. It was a single print. There were no others near it. On either side the moss was undisturbed. Whatever had made the print had stepped down onto that clay and then stepped off in a stride that no human leg could have taken. Crow crouched over the print for a long time without speaking. Then he took a small tape measure from his pocket and measured it, 16.5 inches. He looked up at me, and his face was the face of a man who had been given confirmation of a thing he had hoped was only a story. Behind us, Goes Ahead spoke without turning. He said that in the brush above the trail he had smelled something. He would not describe the smell. He said only that his grandfather had described it to him once, and that his grandfather had described it as the smell that came out of the mountains before a bad winter. We went back down to the group. I did not tell them what we had seen. I told Blackfoot to reroute us along the ridge above the draw, and that we would rejoin the marked line at the second waypoint from the north. He looked at me and did not ask why. Plenty Coos, however, was watching me. When I turned from Blackfoot, the old man was watching me with an expression that I have thought about many times since, and that I still cannot fully describe. It was not fear, it was recognition. By the time we made camp that evening in a flat pocket of the ridge, protected on 3 sides by a horseshoe of sandstone bluffs, the sun was already dropping toward the western rim of the gorge. Curly built a fire in a stone ring and cooked a stew of dried meat and beans and cornmeal. Red Eagle strung a tarp between 2 hemlocks and hung his camera cases from a branch to keep them off the damp ground. Sword Bearer and Harry Moccasin walked the perimeter of the camp together, checking the ground, testing the wind. White Swan set up a small tent for Plenty Coos, so that the elder could sleep sheltered from any rain that might come. The rest of us would sleep under the tarp or in bivvies, spread in a loose circle around the fire. We ate, we talked. Little Robe asked Plenty Coos whether the stones we had seen that day were older than the coming of the coal companies, and Plenty Coos answered that they were older than the coming of any writing at all in this place, that they had been raised by hands whose descendants had been gone from this valley for so long that even the names of the raisers had been forgotten. Crow said that the point of the survey was to bring what could still be known back into the light so that it might not be lost again. Plenty Coos nodded and said only that some things were better forgotten, and that it was the work of the elder to know which was which. He said it kindly, but the fire crackled a little louder after he had said it, and no one spoke for a long moment. I took the first watch. The others rolled into their sleeping bags one by one, and by 10 the camp was quiet except for the low breathing of the fire and the occasional soft flutter of a moth against the tarp. I sat with my back against a rock at the edge of the fire ring, my rifle across my knees, and I watched the tree line. The wood knock came at 11:47. I remember the time because I checked my watch immediately, out of a habit I had developed years earlier at the fire tower. It was a single sharp crack, like a length of hardwood being struck against a standing trunk, and it came from the slope above the camp, about 100 yards up. It was answered, 30 seconds later, by a second knock from the slope below, on the other side of the horseshoe. The two knocks were not made by falling branches. They were spaced too regularly and struck too cleanly. Harry Moccasin was awake before I had turned my head. He had not been sleeping. He was sitting upright in his bivvy at the edge of the circle, and his eyes were open, and his hand was on the haft of a hatchet that lay beside him on the ground. He looked at me across the fire and put one finger to his lips. We waited. The third knock came at 11:52, from directly behind the horseshoe of stone, up on the ridgeline above us. 3 knocks, spaced across 5 minutes, forming a triangle around the camp. I understood then, in the way that a person understands a thing without wanting to, that the camp had been located by something, and that the something had signaled its companions. Before I could reach for the radio, before I could wake the others, the fire hissed and went low, as though the air itself had been pulled sideways. The moths that had been fluttering around the tarp fell silent, and from somewhere at the top of the horseshoe, from the shadowed ledge above us where the last knock had come, I heard the sound of a heavy body settling into a crouch behind the stone. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. Harry Moccasin and I sat awake by the fire, feeding it slowly, keeping the flame low so as not to draw eyes, but high enough that we could see any movement past the ring of light. The rest of the camp slept, or seemed to sleep. I noticed, after some time, that Plenty Coups had left the tent White Swan had set for him and was sitting cross-legged on his blanket at the edge of the fire, wrapped in a heavier robe, his eyes half closed and his mouth moving in a low murmur that I could not understand. He was not speaking English. I did not think he was speaking to me at all. I thought, watching him, that he was speaking to the thing on the ridge, and that the thing on the ridge was listening. The knock did not come again that night. What came instead was worse. Around 2 in the morning, a stone rolled down the slope above the camp and struck the base of the sandstone bluff with a hollow crack. Then another. Then, over the course of perhaps an hour, a slow, steady patter of small pebbles falling into the camp from the ridge above, as though something up there were sitting on the edge of the bluff and idly tossing them down one by one. Not to hit us, only to remind us that it could. Curly woke once, sat up in his bag, listened for a long moment, and then lay back down without a word. He had understood, and he had decided that sleep was the better answer. Before I go further into what happened at breakfast, I want to ask those of you following this account through the channel to take a moment right now, at this exact turn in the story, to leave a like on this video, to write in the comments what you would have done if you had been sitting at that fire ring at 2 in the morning listening to pebbles fall, and to subscribe if you have not already, because these deep country stories do not carry very far without your voice behind them. The sun rose at 7:12. The stone stopped falling 10 minutes before it did. When the light finally came over the eastern rim of the gorge and reached the camp, I got up and walked slowly to the base of the bluff and counted the stones that had fallen into the camp during the night. There were 63. They were arranged in a loose crescent that curved around the fire ring, and not one of them had struck a sleeping person, though several had landed within arm's length of a head. Crow came out of his bivvy and walked to where I stood. He looked at the stones. He looked up at the bluff. He said, quietly, that he had been awake for most of the night and had been counting them too. He said that he had counted 63. He said that 63 was, in a certain traditional reckoning that his grandmother had taught him, the number of nights between the last frost of autumn and the deepest cold of winter. He did not say what the number meant when it was thrown at your camp by something on a ridge in the night. He did not have to. We held a council at breakfast. Plenty Coups spoke first. He said that in the reckoning of his people, an entity that announced itself in this way was not necessarily hostile. He said that the older powers of a place tested those who came into their country before deciding what to do with them. He said that we had been tested and that we had not run, and that this was, in a sense, the correct answer. He also said that we should not press further into the ridge. Crow argued, gently, that the second and third waypoints were only another day's walk away, and that the survey would be incomplete without them. Plenty Coups did not argue back. He only closed his eyes and said that the decision belonged to the leader of the survey, which was Crow, and that he would go where Crow went. Harry Moccasin, when asked, said only that he would stay with the group whatever the group decided. I sat with my hands folded around a tin cup of coffee and said that as the ranger my job was to keep the group safe, and that if we continued we would continue with strict discipline, no one alone, no one out of sight of another for any reason, and that if there were any further signals we would turn back at once. Crow nodded to what I had said, and we agreed to continue. We broke camp at 9. I set the marching order myself. Goes Ahead would remain 20 yards ahead. White Calf would walk with him. Blackfoot would follow with the map, and I would walk with Blackfoot. Plenty Coups would walk in the center of the group, flanked by Crow and Red Eagle. Little Robe and White Swan behind them. Swordbearer and Curly next. Hairy Moccasin, again, at the rear. I told each of them to keep the person ahead of them in sight at all times. If the person ahead went out of sight, the person behind would call out at once. No exceptions. The second waypoint lay along the base of a long sandstone escarpment, where a series of ledges and shallow overhangs ran for nearly half a mile above a talus slope. The photograph in the archive had shown a line of standing stones set on one of the lower ledges. It was on the way to that ledge, at a point where the trail crossed a shallow ravine, that we found the tree. The tree was a young oak, perhaps 8 inches in diameter, snapped off cleanly at a height of about 10 feet above the ground. The broken end was not shattered, as it would have been if the tree had been struck by lightning or torn down by wind. It was twisted, as though something had gripped the trunk with both hands and simply wrung it apart. The upper half of the tree lay across the trail, and it had been positioned. There was no accident in the way it lay. It had been placed with the broken end pointing back the way we had come. The message was not subtle. Anyone who could read a message left in the woods could read it. Plenty Coups walked to the tree and stood beside it for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Crow. He did not say anything. Crow held his gaze for perhaps 10 seconds, and then he lowered his eyes. Without a word, Crow turned to me and said we should turn back. I said we would. We started to reverse the marching order. That was when we discovered that Goes Ahead was gone. He had been 20 yards ahead of White Calf when we had stopped at the tree. White Calf had been watching him. When Goes Ahead had reached the far edge of the ravine, he had stepped behind a boulder to check the trail on the far side. He had done this a dozen times already that morning. He had always reappeared within seconds. This time he had not reappeared, and in the moment that our attention had been on the tree, none of us had noticed. I ran to the boulder. There was no sign of him. There was no sign of a fall. There was no blood, no scuffed ground, no torn fabric. There was, on the far side of the boulder, another single deep print in a patch of wet moss, 16.5 inches long, aimed uphill. Only one, as though whatever had made it had stepped once and then stepped again in a stride longer than the ravine was wide. I called his name once. My voice sounded very small in the woods. No one answered. Hairy Moccasin came up beside me and looked at the print. He said, in a voice that was not shaking but that was pitched lower than his usual voice, that we should gather the group and leave the ridge now. He did not say we should search. There was a difference in the way he said it, and I understood the difference. He had lived in country like this for enough years to know what could be searched for and what could not. We gathered the group at the near side of the ravine. I explained, as clearly as I could, that Goes Ahead had gone out of sight and had not returned, and that we were going to descend from the ridge immediately and call in a search team from a point where the radio would carry to the tower at Grandview. There was a moment when Little Robe began to ask a question, and Plenty Coups placed a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. Little Robe closed his mouth. He was 19. I remember how young he looked in that moment. I hope he does not remember the way I looked back at him. We began the descent. The retreat was faster than the ascent had been, and it was silent. Even Curly, who normally hummed to himself when he walked, made no sound. The wind had dropped completely. The gorge below us seemed to hold its breath. As we passed the clearing with the standing stone, Plenty Coups paused for the briefest moment and touched his hand to the top of the stone. He said one word aloud in his own language. Then he moved on. Halfway down to the maintained trail, at a place where the spur crosses a rockfall, Red Eagle stopped and told me that he could smell something. He did not have to describe it. The smell was already in the air. It was the smell that Goes Ahead had refused to describe the morning before. It was thick and heavy, and it clung to the inside of the throat, and it came from the slope above us, from a place where the rockfall gave way to a stand of hemlocks so thick that the ground beneath them lay in shadow even at noon. We did not stop. We increased our pace. As we passed below the stand of hemlocks, I looked once, only once, up into the shade beneath the trees. What I saw there is a thing I have told to no other person before now. I saw the shape of a figure standing between two trunks, taller than any of the trunks were wide, and the figure was still. Its shoulders were level with a branch that hung 15 feet above the ground. Its face, if it had a face, was in shadow. But I could see its eyes. They were not lit. They did not glow, as people say in stories. They were simply open, and they were looking at me. And there was a patience in them that I have not stopped thinking about since. It was not the patience of a hunter waiting to strike. It was the patience of an old thing that has already decided what will happen and is willing to wait for it. I looked away. I did not run. I kept walking at the pace of the group, and I did not tell them what I had seen. I do not know if any of them saw it too. Harry Moccasin, when he came past that point in the trail behind me, did not turn his head. I believe he did not turn his head because he knew what would be there if he did. We reached the maintained trail at 4 in the afternoon. The radio carried from a bald outcrop half a mile further down, and I called in the emergency from there. A search team was on the ridge by dusk. They searched for 11 days. They found no sign of Goes Ahead. They found the tree, and they found the crescent of stones at our old camp, and they found the print on the wet moss beside the boulder. They took photographs, and they took casts, and they filed a report that concluded, in careful and cautious language, that Goes Ahead had likely fallen into an unmapped fissure in the ravine, and that further recovery efforts were not advised. The report is on file in the park archives. I have read it twice. I have not read it a third time. The survey team came out of the gorge with me on the afternoon of October 8th. 7 of them signed the ledger at the trailhead. The 8th line, where Goes Ahead's signature would have gone at the end of a completed survey, was left blank. Plenty Coos asked me for the pen and drew, in the blank line, a small mark that I have since learned is a mourning mark in the old style of his people. He handed the pen back to me without a word. His hand was steady. I still work in the gorge. I still walk the trails, and I still check the permits, and I still count the packs at the trailheads. I have not gone back to the ridge above Wolf Creek. I do not intend to. Once a year, in October, I take a walk along a maintained trail on the far side of the river, and I look across at that ridge, and once a year I hear, very faintly, a single knock from somewhere in that country. I do not answer it. Plenty Coos told me once, in a letter that he sent me the winter after the survey, that the older powers of a place will accept a mourning mark on a ledger and will consider the matter closed. He also told me that the mark is not a promise, it is a request. Whether the request is honored is not a thing that any of us decides. The country is old, it remembers, and every ranger who walks in it long enough carries a page or two of that memory in his pack when he comes home. There is a form for every kind of trouble that comes down into this gorge. There is a line for a hiker who turns an ankle on the old iron steps at Kaymore, and a line for a raft that flips in the white water below the bridge, and a line for the black bears that learn what a cooler smells like and forget to be afraid of the sound of a person. In the years I have worn this uniform, I have filled out every one of those forms more times than I can hold in my head, and for a long while I believed that somewhere in the thick book the service gives us, there was a box for anything a person could ever meet in a place as old as this one. I do not believe that anymore. What I am setting down tonight fits on no page they print, and if I were to file it in the proper way, I would be asked to sit across a narrow desk from someone with a kind and careful face, who would watch me the whole time I spoke. So I am telling it the only way that is left to me, which is the way an old man tells a thing to a low fire, and trusts the fire to keep it and not repeat it. It began with a request that came up through the regional office in the wet middle of an October a few years back. The sort of request that drifts down until it lands on the desk of whichever ranger has the fewest good reasons to refuse it. And that season the ranger was me. A group was coming to the New River Gorge, 11 of them. And they were not hikers. and they were not the kind of visitors who want one photograph from the lip of the canyon, with the long bridge behind them and a stamp pressed into a little paper book. They were keepers of old accounts, elders and the younger people who travel beside elders to carry what the elders can no longer carry alone. And they had come a great distance east from the high northern country to stand in this particular gorge because of a story that belonged to them. I did not understand the story at first. I understood only that I was to walk with them, to keep them on the safe grades and away from the fallen-in mouths of the old coal mines, and to bring every one of them back out of the gorge again when they were finished, and that the office wished me to be helpful and quiet, and to write nothing down that might trouble anyone later. I have kept that last instruction faithfully until this very night. The eldest of them was a man called Plenty Coues, and he was 74 years old, and on the level ground near the trailhead he leaned on 2 canes and let the younger ones fuss over him. But the moment the path tipped upward and began to drop into the gorge, he handed both canes to the boy beside him and would not take them back. He had a face like the sandstone of the cliffs, all long weather and patience, and eyes that did not miss the smallest thing. And he was the one who told me, on that first evening while the light went out of the sky above the rim, about the counting. Every night, he said, before anyone slept, someone would count the people around the fire and say the number aloud, and the rest would answer that the number was right. It was an old habit from an older time, he said, from country where a family that did not know its own number by heart could lose a child to the night and not learn of it until the morning. I thought it a gentle and sad custom, and I said so, and he looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable and told me that it was not gentle and that I would understand the reason for it before we came back up out of the gorge. I wrote that down in my head and nowhere else, and I have carried it ever since. The boy who took the old man's canes was the youngest of the party, a 19-year-old named Little Robe, and everything about the gorge frightened and delighted him at once, and he asked me the name of every plant and every bird and every rusted machine we passed, and I answered what I could, and when I could not answer he wrote his own guesses in a small notebook he kept buttoned in his coat. Next, in years above him, and about as far from him in temper as a man can be, was Swordbearer, who was 29, and carried himself like a blade that has been kept too long in its sheath, and he had not wanted to come, or he had wanted to come for the wrong reasons, and I could not at first tell which. He did not believe the old story, he told me plainly on the first afternoon, or rather he believed that the old story was a fear grown large in the retelling, and he had come to stand where it began so that he could see for himself that there was nothing standing there. I have met that kind of certainty before in this line of work, and the gorge is patient with it the way it is patient with everything. There were others, and I came to know each of them in the 2 days we had. White Calf was 68, quiet and slow and warm, and he kept the fire the way some men keep a garden, and in the evenings he sang low songs that I did not understand and did not need to understand. There was a woman named Crow, who was 61, and who had been the one to first hear the account that brought them all the long way east, and who spoke rarely and listened to everything. Red Eagle, who was 52, carried the maps and the permits and the small worries of the trip, and he was the one who asked me every hour whether the weather would hold. Blackfoot, who was 47, was the strong, steady center of the group, the one who lifted what needed lifting and said little about it. And then there were the 4 who walked out ahead of us and off to the sides of us and behind us, the ones who read the ground the way I read a trail map. Curly was 44, and he could look at a bent stem of grass and tell you what had bent it and how long ago. Goes Ahead, who was 41, lived up to his name and was always a little farther along the trail than the rest of us, a shape at the very edge of what a person could see. Harry Moccasin, who was 39, watched the mud and the sand along the river for prints and knew every track that a West Virginia hollow could hold. And White Swan, who was 36, did not hear well, and because his ears had given up so much of their work, his eyes had taken it on, and he saw things the rest of us walked straight past. I tell you their names and their years because they matter to what happened, and because a person should be counted properly, especially a person who was in that gorge in those 2 days. 11 of them, and me, which made 12 at the fire on the first night, when White Calf's small blaze pushed back the gloom under the hemlocks and the new river talked to itself in the black below us, older than the mountains it had cut, older than almost anything a person can stand beside. The New River is one of the oldest rivers on the face of the earth, and it was running in its bed before these ridges rose up around it, and it simply kept running while they rose, cutting down as fast as they climbed, so that the gorge is not a valley the river found, but a wound the river has been slowly opening for longer than there have been mountains to open. I told the group this on the first evening, the way I tell it to every visitor, and I expected the polite nods I usually get, but instead Plenty Coups was quiet for a while, and then said that it was good to know the river was older than the thing they had come to find. He did not say what the thing was. Not yet. The first sign came on that first night, and I did not know it for a sign. We had made our camp on a bench of flat ground above the old rail grade, in a stand of hemlock so thick that the sky was only a scatter of gray between the branches, and the fire was low, and White Calf was singing, and Little Robe was writing in his book by the light of it. And I had just finished telling Red Eagle for the third time that the rain would most likely hold off until morning, when a sound came up out of the gorge that I had heard perhaps twice in all my years in that country. It was a single knock, a hard, hollow crack, the sound of a heavy limb swung once against the trunk of a standing tree, and it came from across the river, from the far wall of the gorge, and it was very loud, and then there was nothing. A person who has spent time in these woods knows the sounds they make. A tree that falls makes a long tearing groan and then a crash. A branch that breaks under ice or wind snaps and drops. This was neither. This was one deliberate strike, and then a silence that seemed to lean toward us and listen. I looked up, and I found that every one of the 11 was already looking at me, watching to see what the ranger would do. And I did the thing rangers do, which is to make it small. "It is a beaver," I said, slapping the water, "or a limb coming down somewhere on the far slope. And sound travels strangely in a gorge. It bends and doubles and comes from the wrong place." All of that was true, and none of it was believed, least of all by me. Curly, the tracker, was looking off across the river with his head tilted, the way a man listens for a second sound he already knows is coming, and it did not come. After a long while, White Calf began to sing again, but his song was lower now, and I noticed that he had turned so that his back was to the fire and his face was to the gorge, and I understood without being told that he had done it on purpose so that the light would not be in his eyes. Before we slept that first night, Plenty Coups counted us. He did it without ceremony. He looked around the ring of faces and moved his lips and then said, in English, for my benefit, 12. And around the fire the others answered, one by one, that 12 was right, and I answered it too, because it seemed rude not to. 12. It is a small number. It is easy to hold. I want you to hold it too, wherever you are as you listen to this, because the number is the whole of the thing, and I did not know that yet. In the gray of the next morning, the trackers found the first of the stones. Goes Ahead had walked out along the old rail grade before the rest of us were properly awake, as was his way, and he came back without hurry and spoke to Plenty Coups in a low voice. And then the old man asked me to come and see, a little way down the grade, where a seep of water crossed the old ballast. Someone had built a small tower of flat river stones, 7 of them, largest at the bottom and smallest at the top, balanced with a care that would have taken a patient person a long time and a steady hand. I have seen stacked stones in the backcountry before, for hikers build them, and I take them down when I find them, because they lead other hikers off the trail, and because the park is meant to look as though no one has been there. I said as much, and I reached out to knock the little tower over the way I always do, and Curly caught my wrist. He did it gently, but he did it fast, and he shook his head once. "Leave it," he said. I asked why. "Because whoever built it," he said, "built it so it would be seen, and a thing that wants to be seen is best left standing until you know what it is saying." Harry Moccasin was crouched a few feet off, and he waved me over, and he pointed at the soft ground beside the seep, and I looked, and I felt the morning go cold in my chest. There was a print in the mud. It was longer than my boot by half again, and wider, and it had 5 toes, and it had sunk into ground that my own weight barely marked. I am not a small man. I stood on the ballast next to that print, and I found that I did not have a form for it, that there was no line on any page for what makes a track like that, and I did the thing I had done the night before, and reached for a small word to make it fit. A bear, I said, standing up on its hind legs, the front and back print landing on top of one another so it looks like one long foot. Harry Moccasin listened to me the way a patient man listens to a child, and then he set his own hand flat inside the print, fingers spread, and his hand did not fill it. And there was no claw, and there was an arch to it where a bear has none, and the ball of the foot had pressed deeper than the heel the way a thing presses when it is carrying its weight forward, the way a person does, the way nothing on four legs does. He said nothing. He did not need to. Swordbearer had come up behind us, and he looked at the print for a long moment, and then he laughed, one short sound with no ease in it, and he said that a person with big feet and too much time had made it, and had made the stones too, to frighten visitors. Curly did not look up. He only said that no person had made the print, because he had followed it back from the seep for 40 steps into the rhododendron, and the stride did not shorten, and did not lengthen, and did not once catch on the tangle of stems that a person would have had to fight through, and that whatever had walked there had walked through the thicket the way a person walks through tall grass. Then he asked me, without any drama at all, how far it was to the place they had come to see. Nuttleburg, I told him, a few miles down the grade. An old coal town that the forest has been taking back for 100 years. That is where the account puts it, Plenty Coups said. That is where we are going. We walked down the grade all that second morning, and the gorge closed in around us the way it does, the walls rising up gray and streaked with the black seams of coal that made this a place worth ruining a valley for, 100 years ago and more. And I told the group about the town as we walked, the way I tell it to visitors, because the telling steadied me and I think it steadied them. Nuttleburg was a coal town built into the side of the gorge, and at its height 1,000 people lived there, in houses stacked up the impossible slope, and the coal came down out of the mine mouths high on the wall on a long conveyor to the tipple by the river and into the rail cars, and away. And then the coal ran out, or the market did, and the people left, a few at a time, and then all at once, and the forest came back in. The tipple still stands. The conveyor still climbs the wall into the trees. The coke ovens still curve along the grade like the mouths of 100 small kilns. It is one of the most complete ghost towns in these mountains. And it is a quiet place, and visitors often tell me that it feels watched, and I have always told them that every ruin feels watched, that it is only the mind filling an empty house with the people who used to live in it. I told the group that too. Crow, who had said almost nothing in 2 days, looked at me when I said it, and she said, in a voice like dry leaves, that a house is not the only thing that can be empty and full at once. I did not ask her what she meant. I think I did not want to know. We came to Nuttleburg near midday, and the town rose out of the trees the way a drowned thing rises, all angles that the forest had not yet softened, and the great tipple stood black against the gray sky, and the conveyor ran up the wall of the gorge and vanished into the hemlocks where the mine mouths were, and the coke ovens curved along the grade with fern growing out of their brick throats. The 11 grew quiet as we came into it. Even Little Robe stopped asking his questions. Even Swordbearer, who had laughed at the stones and the print, went still and watchful as we walked in under the shadow of the tipple, and I saw him look up into the machine the way a person looks up at a thing that might be looking back. White Swan, who did not hear well and so watched everything, had stopped at the edge of the town and would not come further for a moment, and when Blackfoot went back for him, White Swan pointed up the slope, above the ovens, into the trees where the conveyor climbed. Blackfoot looked, and then he came back down and spoke quietly to Plenty Coups, and the old man nodded as though he had expected it, and I asked what White Swan had seen, and Blackfoot told me. Something had moved up there when we came in. Something tall that had stood between 2 trees and had not run when it was seen, but had simply stepped back once and let the trees take it. Not a bear, Blackfoot said, before I could offer the word. It stood the whole time on 2 legs, and it was as tall standing as the lowest branch of the hemlock beside it, which I knew, because I had walked under that hemlock 100 times, was higher than a person can reach. We did not camp in the town. I would not have let them, and none of them wished to. We made our fire that second evening on a flat above the grade, downstream of the tipple, where the trees were younger and the sky was wider. And I told myself it was because the ground was better there, and I did not say aloud that it was because I wished to be able to see. That evening, While White Calf built the fire and the light failed, Plenty Coups told me at last what they had come to find. And I will tell it the way he told it, as near as I can hold it. He said that in the old country, in the high cold north where his people had lived, there was a being that walked in the timber and along the edges of the camps, tall and covered in hair, that walked upright as a person walks, and yet was not a person, and was not an animal. And his people had many names for it, and most of the names were not spoken lightly, because to name a thing is to call it. And this was not a thing you called. It was not evil, he said, the way a wolf is not evil. It kept to itself, and it kept the country, and it did not trouble a person who did not trouble it, but it watched. It watched the camps, and it counted the people in them, and this was the part he wished me to hear. It counted. It knew the number of a family the way a family should know its own number, and it did not like the number to change. When a family kept its number, and lived quietly, and gave the country its respect, the being watched and was satisfied, and did nothing. But when people came into its country who did not know the old ways, who took more than they needed, and made more noise than they should, and did not count themselves at night, the being would begin to take an interest in the number, and it would set about, slowly and patiently, to make the number right. I asked him what he meant by making the number right. He looked at me across the fire, and behind him the black shape of the tipple stood against the last gray of the sky. And he said that a country has a number of people it can hold, and that when the number grows too large the being brings it down again, one at a time, so quietly that the people do not know their number is falling until it has already fallen too far. He said that the account that brought them east was an old one, carried west and then east again over many years, of a place in the eastern mountains where a whole town had once stood, 1,000 people in a gorge, taking the black stone out of the ground and making a great noise doing it, and how the town had emptied. People say the coal ran out, he said. People always say the coal ran out, but the account his people carried said that the number had been brought down, a person at a time, over years, until the ones who were left could not have told you why they were leaving, only that the gorge no longer wanted them, and that they had gone. And he had grown old wondering whether the account was true, and he had not much time left to wonder in, and so he had come to stand in the gorge and count. That was all. He had come to count, and to see whether the number would hold. And then he said the thing that I have carried since, the thing I turned over in my head that whole second night. He said, "The tall one does not take what it does not need." He said it the way a person says a thing he has believed his whole life, simply and without fear, as a comfort. The tall one does not take what it does not need. I found it a strange comfort, and I said so, and he almost smiled, and he said that it was the only comfort there was, and that a man learns to be grateful for it. That second night the fire seemed smaller than it should have, and the gorge seemed to press closer, and White Calf's songs did not last as long, and Little Robe sat close to the old men and did not write in his book, and Red Eagle asked me no more about the weather. And late, when the fire had burned down to a low red eye, and most of the party had gone to their blankets, the knock came again, one hard hollow strike, from across the river, from the black wall of the far side, and this time, before the silence could close over it, an answer came. Another knock, the same, from our side of the river, from the trees above Nuttleburg, from the slope where the conveyor climbed into the hemlocks. 2 knocks, calling across the gorge to one another, and the town between them, and us on the flat below with our small red fire, counted and held at 12, while whatever kept the country talked over our heads in a language that was only sound. Sword-bearer did not sleep after the 2 knocks, and neither did I. I lay in my blanket and watched the red eye of the fire and listened to the gorge, and across the low coals I could see him sitting up, his knees drawn to his chest, staring into the trees above Nuttleburg where the second knock had come from. I have learned to read the shapes of people in the night, and the shape he made was not fear. It was worse than fear. It was a man whose certainty had been touched, and who had decided, in the private way a proud man decides things, that he would rather go and put his hand on the truth than lie in the black and let it circle him. I should have spoken to him. I have gone over that many times. I told myself that a grown man sitting by a fire is doing no harm, and I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again the sky through the branches had gone from black to the first ash gray of the morning, and the place where Sword-Bearer had been sitting was empty, and his blanket was folded, and he was gone. I woke Plenty Coos first. The old man came awake all at once, the way old men who have lived hard do, and he looked at the empty blanket and then up the slope toward the mine, and he did not say anything for a moment, and then he said one word, which was the boy's name, quietly, the way you say a name you are afraid you will have to stop saying. We woke the others. Curly and Goes Ahead and Harry Moccasin were up and reading the ground before the rest of us had our boots on, and they found his track leaving the camp and turning up the slope, toward the coke ovens, and above them the conveyor, and above that the black mouths of the mine in the trees. Curly followed it a little way and came back, and his face was carefully empty. He went up, Curly said, in the night, alone, toward the openings in the wall. And then he looked at me, because I was the ranger, because I was the one who was supposed to know the country, and he asked me what was up there, in the mine mouths, in the tunnels. I told him the truth. Old workings, I said, miles of them, going back into the mountain, flooded in places, fallen in others, and we fence them and we post them because people die in them. If he went in there in the night we may not, I said, and then I did not finish, because there was no kind way to finish it. We did not go up at once. Plenty Coos would not allow it, and looking back I understand that he was right, though at the time it made me half wild. He said that we would not go up the slope while the light was still gray, that we would eat and we would wait until the sun was full in the gorge, and that we would call, and that if the boy could answer he would answer, and if he could not, then going up in a hurry and bad light would only add our own number to what the mountain had already taken. I could not sit still for it, but I sat, because it was his party and his boy and his account, and because underneath my wildness I knew the country and I knew he was right about the light. So we called. We stood at the bottom of the slope and we called Sword-Bearer's name up into the trees, and the gorge threw our voices back at us, thinned and strange, and nothing answered. And then, near the full coming of the sun, something answered. It was his voice. It came from up the slope, from the trees near the mine mouths, and it called down to us, and it said, "Help me, I am here. Help me, I am here." The relief that went through the camp was like a warm wind, and Little Robe cried out and started for the slope, and Red Eagle after him, and I felt my own feet move, and then I saw that 3 people had not moved at all. Curly had not moved, Plenty Coos had not moved, and White Swan, who did not hear well, who had not heard the voice at all, was watching the rest of us with a plain and rising alarm on his face, because he could see us reacting to something, and he could not tell what. And something in the way we were reacting was wrong to his eyes. Curly caught Little Robe by the collar and held him. "Listen," Curly said, not to the words, to the shape of them. And we listened, and the voice called again, and it said, exactly as it had said before, with not one sound changed, in the very same rise and fall. "Help me, I am here. Help me, I am here." A person in trouble does not say the same words the same way twice. A person in trouble grows more afraid, or more tired, or hears you coming and changes what he says. This voice repeated, and repeated again. "Help me, I am here. The same, the same, the same." The way a bird will learn 3 words from a farmhouse, and say them forever without knowing they mean anything. And I understood, with a cold that started at the back of my neck and went down through me, that the thing calling in Sword-Bearer's voice had learned the voice the way that bird learns the words, and did not know what they meant, and was using them the only way it knew, which was to bring the number down the slope to where it waited. White Swan could not hear it, and so White Swan was not fooled, and it was White Swan, in the end, who kept us from going up. He stepped in front of the slope with his arms spread, and he shook his head, and he made us look at his face instead of the trees, and his deafness was the one thing in that camp the mountain could not reach, because you cannot lie to a man in a voice he cannot hear. We stopped. The voice called twice more, and then it stopped too, all at once, in the middle of a word. The way a thing stops when it understands that the trick has not worked, and after that the slope was only trees, and the mine mouths were only black holes in the gray wall, and the gorge was very quiet. If you are still with me now, still walking down this grade in your mind alongside all those people who are long scattered from that place, then do the small thing that keeps an account like this alive, and leave your mark on it below. The like and the word in the comments and the follow that tells the ones who gather these tellings that the telling was worth the hearing. Do it now, while the slope is quiet, because I have never told anyone what we found when the sun was full in the gorge, and I am only going to tell it once. When the light was good and high, we went up, all of us together, because Plenty Coos would not let the party split again. We went up past the coke ovens with their throats of fern, and up along the rusted line of the conveyor, and up to the black mouths of the mine in the trees, and we found Swordbearer there. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the sandstone between two of the mine mouths, in the open, in a patch of the new sun, and he was alive. He was not hurt. There was not a mark on him. His eyes were open and he was breathing, and when we came up to him he turned his head and looked at us. And he knew us. I am sure that he knew us. And yet something behind his eyes had gone somewhere and had not come back. Blackfoot lifted him to his feet, and he stood, and he walked when we led him. But he did not speak. He has not spoken of it to this day, I am told. He came down the slope between Blackfoot and Curly, docile as a child, and when Little Robe put a hand on his arm and asked him what had happened, what he had seen, Swordbearer only looked at the boy for a long moment with those eyes that had gone somewhere, and then he looked away, up the gorge, toward the far wall, and said nothing, and I understood that whatever answer there was, he had left it up there in the sun between the mine mouths, and that it was not coming back down with him, and that this was perhaps a mercy. We broke camp fast. I wanted us out of that gorge and up on the rim where the radio worked and the world was ordinary, and for once every one of them wanted the same thing. And as White Calf kicked apart the last of the fire and we shouldered our packs, Goes Ahead, who had walked out ahead of us even now, out of habit, out to the edge of the flat, made a low sound, and we went to him. At the edge of our camp, an arm's length beyond where the firelight would have reached in the night, someone had built a tower of stones. It had not been there when we made camp. We would have seen it. It was built of flat river stones, largest at the bottom and smallest at the top, balanced with that same patient, impossible care, and there were 12 of them. Plenty Coos stood over it for a long time. Nobody spoke, and then the old man did a thing I did not understand until later. He counted the stones aloud, in English for me, 12, and then he counted the people, moving his finger from face to face, and I saw his finger touch each of us, Little Robe and White Calf and Crow and Red Eagle and Blackfoot and Curly and Goes Ahead and Hairy Moccasin and White Swan and Swordbearer, who did not know he was being counted, and me, the ranger, and himself. And it came to 12. 12 stones and 12 people. The old man let out a breath, and it was not quite relief, and he told me, quietly, that the number was right and that we could go. I asked him what the stones were. He said they were a receipt. I asked him for what. He did not answer me. He picked up his 2 canes, which he had refused for 2 days, and he leaned on them, and we walked up out of the gorge, and not one of us was missing, and I counted us 3 times on the way up. 12, 12, 12, and every time the number was right, and every time it was right I felt worse, and I could not have told you why. I have had a long time to learn why. Swordbearer came down out of that gorge with his body whole and his number intact, and something else gone out of him that has not come back. And I have come to believe that the Tall One took from him the only thing it needed, which was not his life. The account says the being brings the number down, one at a time, so quietly that the people do not know their number is falling until it has already fallen too far. I used to read that as a story about disappearances, about people carried off into the timber and never seen again. I do not read it that way now. A few months after we came up out of the gorge, a slide took out a long section of the grade below Nuttleburg, and the mine mouths were fenced deeper, and a stretch of the trail was closed, and it is closed still, and fewer people go down into that part of the gorge now than went down before. The number of the gorge is falling. Quietly, a little at a time, a closed trail here and a slide there, and a town that emptied 100 years ago, so that the people who are left cannot tell you why they are leaving, only that the gorge no longer wants them. And I helped carry 11 people back up out of that country, and I did not lose a single one, and I have never in my life been more afraid than I am of that fact, because it means that a thing that keeps the number looked at the 12 of us and decided that 12 was the number it would let go. And I do not know why it let me be one of the 12, and on the worst nights I am not certain that it has finished deciding. Plenty Coups used to say, the way a man says a thing he has believed his whole life, that the tall one does not take what it does not need, and he said it as a comfort, and I took it as one. I lie awake now on the far side of that comfort, because I have learned that it is true, and that the taking was never the terrible part. The terrible part is the counting. The terrible part is lying in the ordinary night in my ordinary house, long out of that gorge, and hearing the old man's voice in my head moving from face to face, and reaching the end of the count, and not being certain, any more, which number I am, or whether the thing that keeps the country has looked at my house, in my valley, and begun, quietly, patiently, one at a time, to make it right.